gives me great pleasure to introduce John and Sarah. I've looked at their CVs and I've also looked at their program this afternoon, and I think you've all read about them, I'm quite sure, and that's why you're here. So I'm not going to attempt to either read them out to you or praise them. I'm just going to introduce John and Sarah, and I think it sounds like a fascinating program. So after they've done, we'll have some questions at the end. But John, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Sarah's going to start. We're going to do two smaller presentations after that. Because the sun came out, we lowered the blinds. We wouldn't want you to be distracted by the sun.
We're just setting a stopwatch so we don't want to cut John out of time. Okay, I'm just going to, I haven't got any PowerPoints or anything fancy like that. I'm just going to talk and tell you a bit of a story about what we're doing. Before I do that, if I can make this work, I'm going to play this little video and follow it up with a second little video, which will give you a little bit of a feel for about what we're about to talk about. Then at the end of it, I'll finish with another video that shows the very first one of these voyages that we did.
The Windward Bound Trust's annual Youth Leadership Challenge brings together 20 young people from vastly different backgrounds for a 10-day voyage aboard the brigantine Windward Bound. The challenge is open to 15 to 18-year-olds living in Tasmania, 10 locals with an interest in mentoring and creating a more inclusive Tasmania, and 10 from refugee backgrounds who've recently settled here. Are you up to the challenge, or do you know a young person who is? For an application before August 1st, go to windwardbound.com.au.
So that sets the scene and tells you a little bit of an idea. Now I have to work out how we get rid of this. No. We might need our techo. Where is he? Would you like to set that second one up for me, please? That's what happens when you spend too much time sailing ships, you forget the other stuff. Number 2. Okay. Now for the story. Is that going to stop? Yep. In 2011, it's now 2016, I think, still. In 2011, I was a guest speaker at a lunchtime meeting of the Rotary Club of Hobart. Now, we've had a connection with Rotary, which I'll go into a little bit later on, for quite a long time, for many, many years, in fact. In fact, since back before, long before the ship hit the water. As part of my presentation, I presented a planned new youth development and youth leadership program. The program aimed at facilitating the inclusion of newly settled youthful refugees into our general society and assisting in the development of a greater and more varied peer-level network than they appeared to presently enjoy. And one of the things that I'd noticed in my travels around Hobart, and I'm sure this applies to a lot of cities, there are various levels of strata in society, and inevitably the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum seems to be built around industrial estates and way out in the donga, as we say in Australia, but way out in the nowhere. And going out to those industrial estates during the maintenance of the ship, getting various things done, I saw fairly significant numbers of young migrant kids. And one of the other things we do is work with some kids that are fairly disadvantaged, and a lot of them come from those same areas. And it occurred to me that it was a bit of a shame that these people are coming to Australia, and by their very nature they're poor, and that they were being put into these areas, or they were having to go into these areas because they simply didn't have the income. And I thought that's not a great start, because a lot of these kids are very intelligent, even more intelligent than I thought, as we found out over time. And I thought, this is not good. It's not setting up a good future for them to be working in an area that other parts of the country are actually trying to lift up. So I started to think about what we could do about that, and I started to think about this particular voyage. So I talked about it at the Rotary Club. Now, I'm not a Rotarian. I was there as a guest speaker because of what we do with the ship and because of that long connection. But once I told them what I was thinking and told them the story, they saw it as a good fit, because Rotary have a big focus internationally on youth and young people. And they immediately seized on what I was talking about. And I did the thing, and the meeting finished and I wandered off, and a few days later a couple of them rang me up and they came to see me and they said, we'd like to back you somehow in doing this. What's involved? How much does it cost? Well, I'll come to that part of it in a minute, but that was in 2011, so it's 5 years ago. 4 more voyages have happened since then. That first voyage and 3 more. And 3 days after we get back to Hobart following this conference, we're at sea again on the 5th, which is fully funded and fully subscribed. Now, I'll read out a few little quotes here from people, because it's important that you understand, I think, what it meant to some of these kids that went on this voyage. The plan for the voyage was to have 10 young Tasmanians, bright young Tasmanians, who, from right across the spectrum across the island, that would pair up, not necessarily absolutely literally pair up, but would work alongside 10 young refugee kids that we would put on the ship, go to sea for 10 days and put our normal sail training plus whatever else it took to make it work. And one of the girls from the 10 Young Tasmanians wrote at the end of this last voyage, "It was truly an amazing experience that I will treasure for life. For me, the relationships formed on board were the most amazing part of the voyage. I didn't know one person, and I can safely say that everyone involved holds a spot in my heart and is classified as family." One of the refugees, young Richard Nendiao, is the best way I can pronounce it, he's from the Sudan. And he said, after the voyage, I've become more open to people and challenges, from school to everyday encounters. Richard's now volunteering from time to time in a day sail program in port. He went on to say, "My experience along with the emotions from the trip can be summarised with the Dr. Seuss quote, 'Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened.'" And every other young person on that ship had expressed similar sentiments. A few of the refugees were initially anxious about taking part, as to be expected. I'm not sure how much in this side of the world you get to hear about what happens in our side of the world, but in the same way that in North Africa at the moment there are massive people smuggling operations getting migrants across. Well, the same applied from Indonesia into Australia. And in fact, we had a young fellow called Wahid on that voyage, whose headmaster came down to the wharf just before the ship sailed, took me to one side and said, "I just want you to know," he said, "don't tell everybody else, but I just want you to know that when Wahid and his family came across from Indonesia on a boat, they came across on 2 boats. His father and 2 brothers were on one boat. His mother and Wahid and sisters were on the other one. The boat with his father on it disappeared without a trace, and that part of the family was lost." So his mum was very worried about him going on this voyage, partly because of that outcome, but also partly because Wahid was now the man of the house, and he was like 15, I think. But his mum also realised the opportunity, and obviously that she'd been talked to about at the school, and so he was on board. He came, when I had a quiet talk to him later, he was coming because he wanted to get over those demons. He wanted to face what had happened and work through it, which he did. So the manager of migrant support programs for Red Cross in Tasmania praised the initiative by saying the boys forged ongoing friendships with mainstream young people who were on the program in a way that would never have happened with incidental contact with other people. The boys returned glowing with confidence and feeling accepted and supported by mainstream Australians. In turn, they will pass on that goodwill to other asylum seekers and refugees and be great advocates for positive interaction from the wider community. I said to the Rotary people at the time, it's difficult enough being a teenager, let alone having the extra difficulty of being dropped into an alien world. We need to give all the support we can to help these people with their transition into our society. The Rotary Club of Hobart sees this kind of support as vital to the health of the community. Their president said, it's community building at its best and at its most sustainable. So, lots of positives. Now, who and what is the Windward Bound? Well, the Windward Bound, as you just saw, is a 33-metre brigantine. She's modelled on an 1848 designed topsail schooner, originally built in Boston in the United States. She carries a professional crew of 3 to 4 officers, 3 watch leaders, 3 deckhands training to be watch leaders, and a cook. 10 mariners in all, and 22 sail trainees who are usually, but not always, aged from 14 to 18 years of age, and from both genders. She has a multi-berth cabin configuration allowing us to have imbalances of gender one way or the other, and because we don't always get 50-50, so we're not set up for 50-50. If we do, it's a problem. I've got a real problem juggling people around then. Allowing us to have imbalances of gender one way or the other, and allowing for distinctly separated sleeping quarters between the genders. Now, I know a lot of tall ships have just one giant row of bunks and everybody mucks in and so on. That works fine for all of us. It works fine for our general Western approach to things. It doesn't work fine with people from that part of the world. It's one of the big challenges we have is getting girls onto the ship on these voyages, because of the fact that girls are generally pushed back into a corner. They're not allowed to do these outgoing things, and the concept of girls being on board with boys is a big worry for their families, both mum and dad. Now, Jenny's had cause to go and talk to a few families to smooth some of those things over, as have various other people within our organisation and within the organisations that look after the migrants. Doesn't always work. Sometimes they just do a flat no. Other times they sort of bend and let it happen. When it does happen, it does amazing things. We're a very small, we're classified as a medium-sized registered charity. We turn over a cash turnover of about $450,000 a year, and we employ 2 full-time equivalent staff and a number of casual voyage staff, as in the other professional seamen or sea women. Mariners is the word we use in Australia. It defies all gender. We turn over about $1.5 million annually by way of the value of the volunteering and other in-kind of support we get. In Australia, and I presume it happens elsewhere, they have a way of valuing the input. And Sorry, I'm conscious of the time. And they have a way of valuing in-kind input. And they put a dollar rate per hour on the value of our average volunteer and a dollar weight per hour on management and people in management levels. And when we add it all up and we look at the discounts we get from people, the support we get, the things we get donated, I'm talking about products here, not money. The money's counted in other things. It works out to be about $1.5 million a year. It's quite staggering. We currently target 10 youth development voyages a year, each of about 8 to 10 days duration. Some of these are school groups, like group school charters. The school will charter us and put 20 kids on board. And some are open, anyone comes voyages, such as the refugee voyage, student voyages where we open it up to the schools right across the state and kids come along. One from here, two from there, that sort of thing. And we, out of our cash turnover, it's roughly made up of 1/3 grants, 1/3 donations and 1/3 commercial activities. Under our charter deed, our charity deed, we are allowed to operate commercially, but the money, of course, goes back into our programs. So that, it's not always the same as that. Sometimes it's up a bit, sometimes it's down a bit. That's what it averages out at over 4 or 5 years. We do corporate charters, we do, and we have a new one-day program we've developed for schools where we have a 20-foot longboat that works with the ship, and we go away for the day with the ship and the longboat and rotate people through several programs on board. This coming year, we're targeting 40 of those over the year. As well as the voyages and day programs, we offer fully subsidised cadetships for young Australian volunteers who wish to enter the maritime industry as a career. There's one sitting over there. That's Kayla. Kayla's one of our watch leaders. They become leading hands. When they qualify for the cadetship, they stay with us. We put them through all their practical training. We put them through all of their career training, their academic training at the maritime colleges. And they pop out the other side with a ship's master's certificate and a marine engine driver's certificate. So they're instantly employable. They can go straight out into the workforce. So far, we've turned 38 of those out of the ship, 38 qualified masters, and we have two cadets on board at the moment, which that'll make 40 once they graduate. It's a very good program. It's very good because we get good quality upper level crew because they're there because they want to be there. They're there because they've got a target and they're focused and they're inbuilt to learn. And so it's a win-win all round. We provide 3 to 4 financial bursaries a year for those cadets. So we allow that in our budget, and then we work with whoever we actually get. In 2017, we'll be adding at least 3 more 8- and 9-day voyages to our program. They're already on the calendar, and they'll be going to various parts of Tasmania, targeting some of the other areas of Tasmania. We operate primarily in Tasmania with voyages to other states from time to time as an opportunity comes up. Usually, like all these opportunities, you've got to have some funding behind them and so on. But if there's a tall ships event in Sydney or Melbourne or whatever, then we'll cheerfully go. We have Melbourne schools coming to Tasmania to sail with us. And that's a bit indicative of what we do, I suppose. Tasmania is a small island state in Australia. Australia is made up, it's a country bigger than the United States in size. It's made up of only 6 states. The smallest of those is Tasmania. Tasmania is an island about 200 miles. It's roughly triangular in shape. There's about 200 miles on each side. And it's about 150 to 200 miles south of the main Australian mainland. It's a size that is roughly equivalent to Greece or Hungary or Ireland. And while I'm not sure of their populations, our total population is 515,000. 52% of Tasmania is wilderness area, which makes for some great sailing because there's nobody there, never been anybody there, and it's locked up as World Heritage Area. But the rest of the population is spread around the remainder. Hobart, where we operate from, with our home port, has a population of about 220,000 people. The other 300 odd thousand is spread between 3 major centres around the rest. The downside of Tassie at this point in time is it has a very high youth unemployment rate. In 2013, the census reported a 17% youth unemployment. The northwest of Tasmania currently, at the latest figures, has something like 23% unemployment. That makes both a great need for what we do, and also it makes the funding of it a bit more challenging. Of the total population of Tasmania, roughly 30%, it's about 155,000 people, are dependent on welfare of some description. Now, for those of you who don't know, Australia does have a welfare system, everything from unemployment benefits through to age pensions, through to disability pensions and so on. So there's roughly 30% of Tasmania is dependent on welfare, which also creates another issue in terms of funding. It accounts for only 0.08% of all migrant input into Australia. The figures last year in Australia were about 175,000 migrants came to Australia. Not all of them refugees. I think there were only about 23,000 of them were actually refugees. But of that 0.08%, compared with the rest of Australia, there have been considerable numbers of migrants to Tasmania from Bhutan, Nepal, Burma, Sudan, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And Syria now, of course. So we have a very wide spread of refugee bases. So this influx of migration into some of the smaller areas, for instance, 12% of Australia's total Bhutan migrant intake went to the city of Launceston, which is one of our northern cities that I talked about before. So it produces very limited employment opportunities for some of these young people, and Australia is no different to the rest of the world. There is a small core of people that cause a lot of grief by saying a lot of things they shouldn't say, and integration becomes even more important. And radicalisation, which happens in some places more than it does in others, is also an important issue that needs to be dealt with. And part of our belief in setting this voyage up was that it could help all of this, because when young teenagers take on board what's happening in the lives of these immigrant people, and what young immigrants take on board in the way that they're accepted by these young teenagers, it does a lot to settle a lot of this dust in the community. So that was part of the reasoning behind it. So I, as I said, had this idea. Maybe, just maybe, we could put some of these kids together and take them away where there's no devices, there's no interruptions, there's no anything else. Just let them get to know each other, sail the ship, do all the things that we all know that sail training does. And so I took it to the Migrant Resource Centre. The Migrant Resource Centre is one of the quasi-government agencies that helps work with young migrants, or with migrants generally. And I sat down with them and talked to them. It just so happened that the manager of this resource centre at the time was a senior member of the same Rotary Club that I spoke to. And they'd already talked about it. And they made the same observations and decisions that I had. They backed it. So in the course of things, I was talking to the president of the Rotary Club, the same one, and I mentioned it to her. And then she came back to me a couple of days later and she said that they'd had a board meeting and they decided to commit $10,000 a year towards the voyage. Now, a voyage costs for us, without getting into the nitty-gritty details, it costs us $4,500 a day. We need to put $4,500 a day in the bank to run any voyage. And that because the costs are enormous. Our insurance costs, for instance, a year are about $40,000. Very high insurance in Australia, because we have a legal system where we have lawyers who can sue and take a percentage of what they get and so on, so the payouts go up and so the insurance companies get worried. You know how it all works. So $10,000 was a significant bit. It was nearly a quarter of what we needed for the budget for that. Right on top of that, we managed to get 2 more grants of the same amount of money from 2 other sources. The Rotary Club said, we'll commit that for 2 years to help seed the voyage and get it going. So there we were, 30,000 of our 45. So we thought, what are we going to do with that? So we decided, because we have a policy within the trust of not giving handouts to people. We prefer to look at life as people need a helping hand. They don't need a handout. Handouts encourage people to ask for more. Helping hands make them get up and do something. So we went back to it and we sat down and we said, okay, so the mentors that we find for this voyage, mentoring young Australians, we'll give it to them. There's 10 of them, so we'll divide that up. They've each got to raise $1,500 towards the cost of getting the final cost of getting the migrants on board and getting them on board. So we put the call out, and we didn't have that television ad that you saw. That's only very new. That's just happened for the voyage we're about to do. And that was an initiative that came out of the same Rotary Club. I'll tip to that later. But for now, the Rotary Club got right behind it. They provided 4 or 5 people as a kind of working group, as volunteer working group to work with us, because at that point in time, it was Jenny and I basically running the trust, and everybody's time was stretched to the max. So we got to the working group, and the working group, we formulated a plan. We used to meet every week, and they would head out to the various Rotary clubs and talk to other Rotary clubs about providing resources, sponsoring. Did they know anybody that might meet this requirement for being a bright young Tasmanian? And the end result was that in almost no time at all, we had our 10 aspiring young mariners. And they went out and did all sorts of things to raise their money. We had one of them went out and asked everyone he knew for $50. And when he told them what he wanted it for, he got it. And so within about a week and a half, he had his $1,500. And other people did similar things. The local health club sponsored some, and then the local Rotary club sponsored some, and so on. So before we could blink, we were funded. Then we had to go and find the migrants. And that was a more difficult challenge because of all those things I mentioned earlier about pushback from the cultural pushback and so on. But once the education department got involved in that there are, in the state schools, there are, in Tasmania, there are people teachers whose job it is to foster the migrant population of the school. So they got talking to them, and Jenny again went out and talked to some of the young Bhutanese kids about coming. And then before we could blink, we had our voyage. We had our people and we had our voyage. And although wasn't without hiccup, the last morning before the voyage itself, I got a phone call to say that one of the young migrants had pulled out. He wasn't going to come, he was sick. And then, so we were prepared to go anyway. And then about 5 minutes before we were due to sail, I got another phone call to say that if someone can go and get him, he will come. So that happened, so we waited, and away we went. So they were pretty nervous. The one thing I'd been forewarned about the Bhutanese particularly was the girls, if you asked the girls a question, they would immediately look at one of the fellows, even if they're not related to the fellow. They'd leave it to the fellow to answer the question. And that was we were warned that this would happen, and we were warned that they were, as females, they were pretty much under the thumb. So we thought, okay, we'll set out to change that. We can't have that. So it was actually a very, very interesting exercise from our part as well. Prior to the voyage starting, the Rotary Club, same Rotary Club, happened to have a member who, I'll talk to you later about the power of Rotary, but happened to have a member who ran a mentoring training program. And on an international level, she was sent all over the world doing this stuff. So she put her hand up and said, I'll run a mentoring session before the voyage. And we started the mentoring session we did it actually the night before the voyage because we weren't sure how this was going to work. And since then we've changed it. Now we do the mentoring with the refugees on board. And we do it watch by watch before the ship actually, we go to anchor, and then we do it after that. So the voyage itself had a lot of pros and cons. It had a lot of challenges. It had some language difficulties. It had some interesting food challenges because we discovered very quickly that some of these people didn't have porridge and bacon and eggs for breakfast, but they liked chili noodles. And so we got around that problem a little bit by quietly suggesting to a couple of them that they might like to go and show the cook how to cook the way they cooked, and which they did. And so we had this great fun. And by the end of the voyage, half the crew were having chili noodles and other unusual dishes, and half of the refugees were having porridge and bacon and eggs. It was a very interesting cultural change. So we departed the wharf, and as we always do with all of our voyages, we went to anchor. We spend the first night at anchor. We put them through all the safety stuff. We get them all settled into the ship, run watches through the night, anchor watches through the night. The one thing we weren't sure how it was going to work, but we were going to try it anyway, was we have a program called rope races. Now, rope races are something where, during the anchor watches at night, the watch leaders are showing the kids how to tie various knots and things. We have a list of them that they have to learn on night one. And then the next morning, we get one volunteer out of each watch to have a go at tying the knots. Points are recorded. There's a prize at the end of the watch, which we don't tell them what it's going to be. It's usually a whole pile of chocolate, which is pretty welcome at the end of 10 days too. Anyway, we ran the rope races. Well, funnily enough, we had 2 young Australians and 1 refugee put their hand up to come and have a go. And then after we'd done the 5 knots, then I named parts of the ship, and usually safety parts for the first couple of days, and they have to rush off and the first person touches and gets a point. So that actually worked quite well. Then the rest of it, I won't go into the long story of the actual voyage itself. It worked extraordinarily well. There was the usual bouts of seasickness. I don't know how the rest of you sail trainers in the room think about seasickness, but we find that to us it's a very, very important part of the whole, because psychologically, to bring everybody down to one level of despair, everything goes very well afterwards, okay? And it is despair. It is despair. We say that there are 3 stages to seasickness. The first stage is when you think you're going to die. The second stage is when you're sure you're going to die. And the third stage is when you're afraid you're not going to die. Then you get better. And that happened, of course. As you'll see when I run the last video, there are some very interesting faces in the very early part of it. Some quite miserable looking people that wish they were somewhere else. But by the end of it, it's all smiles. Now, the other thing we did at the very end of the voyage, which was a bit of a gamble because I wasn't sure how it was going to start, how it was going to be taken. We went down to a place, a nice sheltered inlet down the bottom of Tasmania, and I announced that everyone was going ashore to the beach. Then I announced that what they were actually going to do was they had 2 hours to come up with a concert act, because that night we were going to put on a concert. Well, you call it a sod's opera in Australia, but it's just it's a concert. I didn't expect much of a take-up, but boy, it was amazing. We had, not only did they do group things, the plan is that you have a watch do something and a watch do something, and then some individuals if they want to. Everybody got involved, and you'll see some photos in there of them doing it, and the laughs and smiles on the faces of the refugee kids getting involved. And that was when we knew we'd really broken the ice and that the whole voyage was going to work. And I'll show you that in a few minutes. The only other thing I want to mention is the importance of getting, if you're thinking about doing this yourselves, the importance of getting outside support, vis-a-vis Rotary. I can't recommend, Rotary is an international organisation, and don't ever forget that. In Australia it's very powerful, in the rest of the world it's very powerful. And Rotary clubs have a burning desire to work with their community, to help their community, and to work with young people. Youth work is the main key for Rotary. That's what they're mainly focused on. They think about youth exchanges and various other things that Rotary do. We started out as a supported. I'll tell you one thing that was quite interesting. With the Rotary Club, they gave us 2 years, remember, of $10,000. So the 3rd year, I went to them and I said, look, I know you're not giving us any money this year, but would you be prepared to actually support a mentor, find a mentor and help them focus on their fundraising? So they rang me back the next day and they said, no, we're not going to do that. But we're going to give you another $10,000. So you cannot get past the support they give. We are now supported with this voyage by the entire Tasmanian district of Rotary clubs. The district governor picked it up, was so impressed with what was happening, and we're now getting a similar amount of money from the district as a whole. And so far, I think out of the Rotary clubs, 40% of the Rotary clubs in the state support this voyage either financially or practically by assisting the finding of people. So I just need to pass that on to you. Rotary is an extraordinarily powerful organisation. It has a great deal of support for anything that is working, and of course getting these kids settled down into society is a very important part of the whole thing. Remember, Rotary is of the community, it works for the community, and it also works for humanity. That's the thing that they're working with. And what they see is happening with these kids. One of the Rotarian ladies right back in the beginning set up a closed loop Facebook program for the first voyage, and the kids are still chattering away to each other on that program 5 years later. And we've done it with every group since. It's a closed loop, no one else can get into it, just them. And they're still in contact with each other. Last year's voyage group have been back to the ship about 3 times, just to come back and have what they call the reunion at the ship. And some of those kids travel from all over the state to get there to do that. And one of them has expressed a desire to get them together again for a bit of a sail somehow. So all I can say to you is it works. Take it on board. I have we have developed a manual of how this voyage works. The Rotary Club that we started with is also developing a manual on how to get the Rotary organisations involved. We're quite happy to make that manual available to anybody who's interested and anybody who thinks they'd like to try working the same thing. The only requirement is that you sign an agreement to say that you will follow the plan, that you will not. It's quite a bit like Amway. You've got to follow the plan. Well, in this, the
quote has just gone up.
But follow the plan because it works. Don't reinvent the wheel. Tweak it to work within your own communities and that sort of thing, but it does work. Okay. Now I'm just going to run this last little thing, and what I might do is just let John take over and do his thing, and at the end, if there's any questions, we'll cheerfully do what we can at the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Can I have a bit of help here again, please? Some of my crew are disgusted with me and the way I struggle with computers. That's number 3. Remember, this is the first voyage, but it at least gives you an idea of how it works. So there you are. As you can see, they look totally miserable at the end, didn't they? And that's a little example of some of the help we got. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that it's a wonderful program. All I have to do now is follow it. I won't let you go first again. Which one's that? Yeah, that one. My name's John Simpson, and for several years I was the General Manager of the Sydney Heritage Fleet. There are some connections between what I'm about to tell you and some of the things that Sarah was illustrating. Geographical connections, but also some personal ones as well. I'm going to tell you two stories. This story is about trying to run a sailing ship, trying to break even with the sailing ship, which is, we're all trying to do. Some of us are trying to make a bit of money, but this was just an attempt to break even. And some of the things that people try and do to do that, and the effects that it has on the culture of the organisation and of the people working for it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a sailing ship called the James Craig, which is a restored vessel. She was built in 1874 in the northeast of England, in Sunderland, and she was restored by the Sydney Heritage Fleet. So the starting point is this. This was the James Craig in 1972. This is in Tasmania. This is in Research Bay in Tasmania, which is about as far south as you can get in Tasmania. And she'd been hulked there for 40 years. She was left there in the 1930s to be used as a coal hulk. There was a coal mine on the shores of this particular bay, and she was left there. Sydney Heritage Fleet needed a tall ship. There was a particular site that they wanted in Sydney, and they put their hand up and said, look, we're the only maritime museum in Sydney, this site must be ours. If you're going to put a maritime museum there, it's us. And the guy who was running it said, you're not a proper maritime museum. And they said, don't be stupid, we've got steamships, we've got sailing ships, we've got rowing boats, we've got sailing dinghies, we've got it all. And he said, you haven't got a tall ship. And we said, not a problem, we'll go find one. So a guy called out in Edinburgh set off with the charts of Australia, and he started ringing the police stations in whose jurisdiction he knew there to be a wreck. So he'd find a wreck on the chart, find the police station, ring them up and say, what can you tell me about this wreck? Well, I think he probably got the phone slammed down on him quite a few times. The average copper has probably no idea where the wreck is, and they're not necessarily all above the water. But as you get further south, there are more and more wrecks. Ships coming around the southern end of Tasmania would look for the nearest safe harbour they can find, and Research Bay is that safe harbour. So ships tended to wind up there. A guy called Carl Corton, who will be known to some of you as a sailing ship restorer, Saviour Carl, he goaded a number of populations around the world into saving a particular sailing ship. If you ever go to Bristol in the UK, there's a sailing ship there. Well, sorry, it's not a sailing ship; it's a steamship, sailing ship there called the Great Britain. Thank you. I appreciate the cue. Magnificent ship, wrecked in the Falkland Islands. Corton got onto the Bristol newspapers, which was where the ship was built, and said, if you lot don't come and save this ship, I'm taking her to America. Uproar! The population of Bristol said, no, this is our ship, we'll tow it back, we'll do that. He played exactly the same trick with this ship. He got onto the local population and said, if you don't come and pick this ship up, we're going to do it. So, this ship had been used as a coal hulk. She was in a very beautiful part of the country. This is the Harts Mountains in the background here. If you walk around here, you walk around there with a decent bottle of Semillon, 5-year-old Semillon would be good, and an old screwdriver, because the oysters here are about the size of your hand, and you just knock them off the rocks, chisel them open, gut swallow of wine, and an oyster. The water is so clear you can see the crayfish walking around the bottom. I exaggerate a little, but not too much. Not too
But
much.
don't say too much because I'll have a different kind of boat people turning up.
Yes, rich people with big yachts. The first step after finding this was to try and get this thing floated or refloated, and this is quite a remote area. It's about 20 k's from the nearest road. There's no power there. There's a pretty sparse population here. And teams of people from Sydney spent their holidays camping in the bush trying to get this thing refloated. And what they've done here is to collect real estate agent signs and to try and plug the holes in the side of the ship with it. They stood in the water with arc welding kit, tacking plates on the outside of this ship. Do you know how stupid that is? Do you know how likely you are to kill yourself by doing that? The minimum that's going to happen is you're going to stun all the fish around you. You get a good feed of fish, but you stand a fairly good chance of killing yourself or a workmate. This is the deck of the ship. And you can see here these dumps. These are the bolts. We call them dumps. I'm not sure if that's a universal expression. These were the bolts which hold the deck on. The deck of this ship started to rot, and the local kids were playing on it. And so the locals decided what they'd do is burn the deck off. So they did. So they just burnt the entire deck off. They'd also taken off pretty much everything that you could salvage from this, one way or the other. And then the ship started, just a few other. This is the lower portion of the main mast and the lower portion of the foremast there. There's the futtocks there. That's pretty much all you can see. The ship started wandering around. There were a few fishing boats there, and she used to break her moorings and float around the bay, and she was regarded as a bit of a danger. So somebody took a fairly large quantity of explosive and blew a 3-metre hole in her stern to sink her. Now, we've taken this ship back down to Tasmania several times, and each time we go down there, somebody will come aboard the ship and go, "It was my great uncle that lit the fuse on that lot." Or somebody else will come up and say, "We know where the ship's wheel is." And we say, "Yes, so do we. Can you get it back? Because they won't give it to us." But we collect odd bits of this ship over the intervening 20 or 30 year period. The guy who found it, this guy out in Edinburgh, went back to the board of the Sydney Heritage Fleet, and on the board at the time was Sarah. And he said, "We can restore this ship." And the obvious first question, how long is it going to take to restore? Answer, 3 years. To an alongside museum piece, not to a sailing vessel, but to an alongside museum piece. You can do it in 3 years. How much is it going to cost? $180,000, he said. Right, the board said. Great foresight, go for it. We'll get this thing, we'll tow this thing up, we'll restore it, that'll work. This is the best example of project scope creep I have ever come across in my life. And I'll tell you how long it took and how much it cost just a little bit later in the presentation. But you can see from this that the structure of the ship is basically sound. The ribs are in the right place. If you saw the photograph of the Cutty's Heart when she burned and you saw those ribs all over the place, that as a rebuilding job was completely out of the box. And the Cutty's Heart, I think, cost 68 million sterling to rebuild, something like that. James Craig did not cost anything like that much. But they're roughly the same size ships. They were produced in, they're roughly the same age and of similar complexities. So we went from this in 1972 to this in 2003. So this is a 1,000-ton, 3-masted bark under full sail, and this is a volunteer restoration project. Lots and lots of volunteers involved in this. Run with a volunteer crew and one of a fleet of 9 vessels within this ship. This is the largest one, but it's not the flagship of the company, of the organisation. And she's magnificent. She's doing, doing 10 knots there. She has a couple of large propellers hanging at the back which slow her down by a couple of knots because they don't freewheel as well as I'd like them to, or they don't fold up either, but never mind. This is just a few facts about it. The cost here, 180,000, was actually 23 million. This is volunteer labour, stuff that was scrounged, cash. Nothing like 23 million in cash. Lots of stuff was scrounged. We have got one of the 8 scroungers in the world. We needed 2 diesel engines for this vessel. Fairly decent sized diesel engines, it's a 1,000-ton ship. And we said to him, go and get 2 diesel engines. And he said, all right. And he came back and he said, I've got 2 MTU 12 litre 6-cylinder diesel engines, 12.7 litre. Which is, he said, that'll do, that's all right. He said, good. And everybody was patting him on the back. And he said, did you get the gearboxes? And he said, no, you didn't ask for gearboxes, you just asked for the engines. And we said, well, how are we going to stop the ship? You know, this is not a direct drive ship. We need a gearbox. We have to put the thing in reverse. And he came back and he said, well, these make to ZF gearboxes. ZF is manufactured in Italy. I need to go to Italy to get these. I can't get them out of the ocean. And so the board said to this guy, who's an Olympic yachtsman and an America's Cup yachtsman, they said, right, if you go to Italy to get these gearboxes, if you come back with them, we'll pay your airfare. If you come back without them, then you've obviously been on holiday, so we're not going to pay your airfare. He came back with them. But just a few things here. The volunteer crew is approximately 100 people, maybe 150. We need volunteers to crew this ship, so we train the volunteers to do this. And it costs about $100, and it takes about 4 days to make somebody competent. Make somebody safe, I should say, rather than competent. I mean, competency takes a little longer usually. The crew motivation. Now, I've told you the story about the restoration of this. You have to imagine what the feelings of the crew are towards the ship. This is their ship, they possess it, they own it, they've worked on it, they've done this for a number of years. Their feelings about their ship are really quite intense. They have a series of different motivations for doing this. Go back one. And this is what they do with them. About 20-day sails a year, sleepovers, alongside charters. This is deck events of one kind or another. Harbour charters, you can take 200 people on a harbour charter, closed water charter. And it runs trips to sea, 3 to 4, between a weekend and 3 weeks long. It's also a static exhibit. It's one of the exhibits of the Australian National Maritime Museum, and it's housed in Darling Harbour, along with that. You see the revenue gap here. The need to raise about another $150,000 just to keep this running, keep this ticking over. So, what are we going to do? We're going to do some sail training. Okay, easy peasy. This is the James Craig's culture. Interestingly, the 2 largest demographics are women 18 to 35 and men 55 to 70. And as 2 groups, they get on quite well, actually. It's quite an interesting dynamic there. But inclusive, friendly, supportive, enthusiastic, just about no knowledge of personal development practice at all. So sail training is going to come as something of a learning curve. Introduced to a project called the Halmstad Project. The Halmstad Project is the community development project of a professional personnel development organisation. It's a major business-led coaching company, and they have a very substantial research base to their work. Most of their work is evidence-based and huge research based. They have put together a fairly innovative program, which is based on attracting students from low SES schools, low socioeconomic sector schools, in 2 12-week programs, which include 2 days at sea and 5 days at sea. It doesn't have to be at sea. This could be a bushwalking program, or it could be any other kind of adventure program. The project provides mentors. The mentors are master's degree behavioural scientist students. Most of them have just finished the 1st degree, so this is probably their 4th or 5th year at university, something like that, depending on whether they did honours or not. the master's degree students had some difficulty communicating with some of the watch leaders. This is the way the project is marketed, and they do a good job of marketing. They raise about $500,000 a year for these projects. And James Craig did 3 iterations of this project over a period of 18 months. There was a very poor cultural fit between these people who had identified with this ship and had crewed it, and the mentors in particular. The Helmsman project didn't define the sailing program, didn't define so the ship actually wrote their own program. Now, there was some pros and cons about that, but having written the program, the people who wrote it then thought this is our program, this is what we're going to do something with this. That wasn't the opinion of the Helmsman project, so there was a little friction there at the same time. As the program went on, it became harder and harder to recruit crew. This was a less good experience, it's a volunteer crew, and so it became more difficult to get the crew on board. And the 2 outcomes of this, the 2 learning points, is that the program needs to be driven by a social imperative. I think if you've gone to the crew to begin with and said what we want to do is to run sail training with groups of students from low SES schools, and we've got some participation in the following ways, it would have been a different result. But what was explained to the crew was we need to make 150,000 and these people will pay us. So it was treated by the crew much more like a charter. And in retrospect, that was not the way to introduce it. And the crew's got to be committed to and understand the program completely. Taking master's degree students from Sydney University, sticking on the deck of a sailing ship at sea, and the crew and the watch leaders saying, okay, we need to do this, and the mentors are going, oh, what does that mean? How would that be interpreted by my mentees and so on? It's probably not the best way. You're not going to get the best experience out of it. So, they haven't done it again. But I mean, I think it's an interesting way of looking at the culture of an organisation and trying to marry those 2 cultures together. And I think it was worth commenting on. And I need to find the second presentation. Excuse me a second. This one is a more sensible way of making money and of having some fun. Nearly all of us who run ships have got some kind of maintenance base. We've got a yard, a shed, a wharf, something like that. And usually we've got some volunteers or some expertise, maybe paid, who can assist us in maintaining our vessels. This is Sydney Harbour in the 1960s. And at each one of these wharves here, you can see a ship. This is Circular Quay here, this is Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Opera House is over here, but it's pretty busy and it's a maritime environment. This is Sydney Harbour in the 1930s. I don't know why I said 1950s there. So it's about 30 years before that, a generation before that. And again, there's dozens of wharves along here. This is Darling Harbour. I don't know if any of you have been to Darling Harbour. It's a pleasure palace now. There's not a commercial vessel in there at all. It was at this time the hub of the coastal shipping operation within Australia, and if you wanted to move anything in Australia in the 1930s, 40s or 50s, it went by sea. None of the railroads met up. Every state had built railroads with a different gauge, so everything was transshipped every time we got to a state boundary. Nobody built any roads until MacArthur came along during the Second World War and started building them. So it all went by sea. So a big coastal shipping operation within Australia. And really what I'm doing is making the point that there was a huge amount of industry and a huge amount of maritime activity within Sydney Harbour. This is what Sydney Harbour's like now, and this is one of the many music festivals that goes on there. You can see the Opera House here and the Harbour Bridge in the background. And this is much more typical of the activity which goes on in those foreshores than the two previous pictures I've shown you. Opera House lit up for Vivid Festival. Eno doing the lights, looking fantastic. And this is what Sydney Harbour is going to look like into the near future. This is Darling Harbour. So where I showed you where all those wharves were, this building here is going to be another bloody casino. I have no idea. I do know why, but I don't think that does anything for anybody. And this is a park. But you don't see any commercial shipping in any of this area at all, and it's just not there. So the effect of this is that up until about 1970, there was a working harbour. That's all moved to botany, with the exception, excuse me, of cruise ships. There's now about 170 cruise ships a year, something like that, coming into Sydney. 4 or 5 cruise ships based there. A couple of oil tankers come in each week. And there's a naval base in Sydney. There is no container ships, there's no break bulk cargo, there's nothing else going on there. There was a huge amount of waterfront industry. There is now very expensive waterfront housing. All that industrial side has become expensive housing. There was a lot of marine related employment. Now the employment is service sector, finance sector, and tourism. Just about everybody, just about every kid in Sydney had some connection with that harbour. They knew somebody who worked there. Their parents worked there. Their uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters worked there. There is very little personal connection amongst school children, school kids, with the harbour now. And if there is, it's a recreational one, and it's either fishing or sailing. As people have become more concerned about the fish stocks in the harbour, it's less likely to be about fishing. So that's what has happened. 14 to 16-year-olds view of the greatest harbour in the world, and I've visited most of the great harbours in the world, and I really can say that Sydney is just the best. Don't care where you're from, I'll argue with anybody. It's much less accessible. You can't get out on the harbour. You can't get to it. The housing is between you and the harbour. It costs much more to access it, so you're less likely to do it. You're likely to live further away. Those housing sites that have been sold off mean that people have moved away from the water. Well, most of the families have moved away from the water. You're much less likely to know people who work there, and you're unlikely to view maritime activity as a potential employment. And you may travel by ferry occasionally, and you may fish or sail, but as I say, the fishing has declined. 24% of Australian students don't graduate year 12, and this is the best result. If you live in Northern Territory, it's 50%. In Tasmania, it's about 60%, something like that. And we know that if kids don't finish high school, the probability is that they will have less good health, more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, much more likely to be unemployed. The comparison unemployment rates is dramatic. More likely to be pregnant, more likely to have a criminal record. All those things follow if people don't finish secondary school. So keeping people at school is a useful thing to be able to do. Costs. Lowest cost I can find is about 52,600 Australian dollars. Median cost is an American figure of $127,000. That's the cost to society of somebody not finishing secondary school. So, keeping kids at school is a useful thing to do. And it becomes more useful if you can produce some kind of activity which doesn't actually happen in school, because most of these kids are trying to get out of school. Is there anybody else here who desperately wanted to get out of school? No? Yes? Somebody said yes. Yeah? Yeah. When I was 15, I wanted to get away from my family, who were terrible, and I had to get out of school. And so I tend to identify with some of this. I was surprised how good my family were about a year later, but they all got sane. It was quite dramatic. Allowing students to gain some usable skills, some realisable skills, is worthwhile. And you need to be able to target this at kids who show negative behavioural traits. So the people who screw up the class, the people who annoy everybody else, the people you can't trust to walk down a corridor without graffitiing something or kicking something or doing whatever else. You need to be able to target those people in particular. And you need to be able to direct it at the beginning of the school year because those behavioural traits will become ingrained, and so you need to do that to start with. So what we did was to take a general purpose hands course. General purpose hands course is the level 1. It's the lowest level course that you can do as a seniorship course. Most of it is not based at sea. So you can do this out of your maintenance facility. You can do this out of a tin shed somewhere. You need a couple of other facilities, and I'll go through some of those. But these components of this down here, from knots and splicing down to follow safe work practices, you don't have to be at the sea to do those. You do need to do, it makes sense to do some collision regulations at sea, because it doesn't matter how many times you do that in the classroom, nobody ever gets that until you see that boat approaching your starboard bow. And it helps in terms of vessel safety management systems if you can do some time at sea as well. So we put people through a general purpose hand course, and this is the firefighting component of that, and this is proper fires. 4 people, 2 hoses. Put your hand through that water screen and you will get burnt. Don't talk to the person next to you, and 14-year-old males in particular are not very good at talking to the people around them, and you're going to get burned. So this is real stuff. It's not about putting an asbestos blanket over a fat fire or a chip pan or something like that. This is rather more intense. And this is the same component of firefighting and survival that you would need to do if you were going to sail a yacht in the Sydney to Hobart race, a major offshore race. They have to do the survival course. We use Qantas's pool. They have a 5 metre deep pool just off Sydney Airport, which they allow us to use. And everybody goes in there for half a day, fully clothed, and gets the lights turned off, the sprinklers turned on, hoses squirted in their face, and then people start shouting at you. And at that point, you're completely disoriented. And you've all done this. And this is, a simulation of going over the side of a vessel. In this case, it's a simulation of going over the side of a vessel in a reasonably heated pool without any wave motion, but it gets worse. And the other thing is why do life rafts always float the wrong way up? I don't know. They always, all my life rafts have floated the wrong way up, so you learn how to put these over. A little bit of anchor handling. This guy here, Andrew, his mother said, I despaired of this guy. I really would not know. I wouldn't trust him to do anything at school. As soon as I let him out of my sight, he was going to be a problem. Absolute concentration. Give somebody a boat to control, and it concentrates the mind really quite considerably. This is graduation. This is the Mayor of Sydney and the Deputy Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore and Marcel Hoff, and we just invited them to come along and do this. Big deal. If you're a 14, 15-year-old kid, this is a big deal. And so we also say to them, you can take one of our vessels out into the harbour, and you can invite your colleagues and your parents and your tutors and take them for a trip around the harbour, which they do. That's the vessel they take out. This is a 1902 gentleman's schooner, rather beautiful J-class, ex-J-class yacht, more or less ex-J-class yacht. What we require of the students is that they keep a log of all their sea time, so they can use their sea time to count for other qualifications. That they present to a synopsis of them. They do an audio-visual presentation to a whole school assembly. So there's 1,200 students there, and for the first time in their lives, these kids are standing up there and they're proud of something that they've done. So they receive a huge amount of kudos from them. We ran 4 courses, 6 schools participating in that. There are now 26 schools doing the same course within New South Wales, so we think that's quite a good result in that sense. And a further 3 of those are providing level 2 courses, are providing coxswains courses. Maritime studies is now taught throughout the East Coast seaboard in New South Wales. It's not taught around the GPH course, it's taught around boat licences and environmental aspects. Getting paid for it. We found it was very easy to raise funds for this course. You can put your hand out to a philanthropist. I wouldn't suggest that's what you do. Education authorities have an interest in keeping children in school and will pay to do that and would provide funds for this and did. There was youth and juvenile justice funds. Again, keeping people out of the youth justice system is worth money, and so that happened. Sponsorship. You can go and get some sponsorship from somebody who may identify with these kids. Alternatively, you can work out a shared value partnership. And by a shared value partnership, I mean that the sponsor exposes some of their staff or some of their pupils to some of the things that the children are doing. So either they provide people to be mentors in the kind of way that Sarah was talking about, or they provide some other input. It may be a work experience input that you can go through this. The other alternative is social value bonds. And I don't know if these operate in other countries, but venture capitalists will put up money to be repaid by the government dependent upon particular outcomes. So if you can attribute a cost to somebody not dropping out of school, it's possible to get venture capitalists to bet that they will, that the outcome of your project will satisfy that requirement and to pay you up front for bringing the project on. They will do so at a fairly steep discount. But it's another way of being able to do this. And social value bonds are working in Australia. I believe they're working in the UK and I think in Canada. I'm not entirely sure. So there are some good ways for getting paid for this, one or the other. Right. Any questions? Is that all right, man?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think John and Sarah deserve a big round of applause.
Yay!